Hey, this is Zane Simon. I'm back for my once monthly solo show, the UFC Cutting Room Floor, where I'm talking about all the ins and outs of the UFC roster moves for the past month, who's been signed, who's been released, what's different, new, changed, going around, same as always. Um, and frankly, this month there's not a whole lot. Um, I expected to see the UFC start to be cutting about as many people as they were signing lately. That seemed to be a trend that they were building towards. They had slowly been signing fewer fighters, releasing more. And then this month, they cut almost no one and signed a pretty good number of people. So it was kind of a little bit more like their 2014 early 2014 2013 kind of year and kind of time when they were just signing everyone they could and not releasing anyone. This was a little bit more that kind of month. Kind of surprising, but I mean, month to month they're looking at their own facts and figures and figuring out what they want to do. And who am I to try to predict the future? I can only tell you what's going on in the present. And in the present, the only two fighters released this month officially, as I believe they also announced the release of Steven Seiler, who's fought several times outside the UFC. But the only two fighters they announced the release of this month. Once again, this is all secondhand, unofficial through tracking their website changes. They didn't come out and do a press release and say we've cut these fighters. They've updated their website, pulled these names off of it. Um, what little tracking they do for their website, they have done, and the two names to come down this month were Robert Drysdale and Antonio dos Santos. Drysdale, more known for his coaching career in MMA and jiu-jitsu, frankly, than anything else. It's kind of a small surprise. I mean, it's not a it's not a big surprise in that he has failed two drug tests two in one UFC bout, I believe. Yeah, he exits with a 0-0 and 1 no contest record, but he failed a pre-fight drug test before his debut, and then he failed a post-fight drug test after he finished serving his last drug test suspension and finally got his debut. So that's kind of an inglorious exit for Drysdale. Interestingly, and this is worth knowing, just when you're looking at their general application of what is likely to be their application of drug testing policies going forward, Drysdale was released after serving his 1 year suspension. So the UFC not only did they, not only did he get suspended for a year, but it looks like the UFC kind of kept him under contract for that whole year potentially. I mean, I don't, like I say, this isn't like I've got the official word, but uh, he was, still up and listed as one of their fighters for that full year. And then that suspension ended just last month, and now he's gone. So, even if they are going to release guys after failing drug tests, it looks like they may make them wait out their suspensions under contract before releasing them. At least that's what it appears they've done with Drysdale. The other name, Antonio dos Santos, it's a little bit of a sad moment for me because I actually think Antonio dos Santos is a pretty interesting fighter, a good long-term project in the sport, somebody who has some skills that could mean something down the road, but probably somebody who got to the UFC too early and faced too high a level of competition. I mean, it looked like he was doing pretty well against Daniel Sarafian in that short bout before he injured his hand. And then he met Scott Askham, who has a lot more fights under his belt, is really kind of a tough, gritty fighter, and just put a beating on him. Dos Santos, somebody who looks like he has some physical tools, has some athletic ability, even has some well-rounded parts of his game. Like, he's not a bad scrambler, is hard to take down, hits really hard, all that kind of stuff, but not somebody whose game was complete enough to rely on his striking to the extent he did in the UFC. Not a consistent enough striker to just put guys away with one shot. And when he wasn't putting guys away with one shot, then the amount of muscle you're walking around with, and his gas tank and the lack of polish on his game made him kind of a liability. Unfortunately for him, as he's already been fighting for quite a while, he started his career back in 2009 and has fought irregularly since then. Like, he's only got a 6-3 record, only 9 fights in 6 years. This does put him in kind of an odd position. I mean, I don't know if it's right to expect that he will go back to the regionals, win 2 or 3 fights, come right back to the UFC, or if we've kind of seen him get really tested in his career when he finally decided to try and put things together and get to a consistent fighting schedule and just fall down, and we may not see him come back after that. Like, it's an interesting point to see a fighter like that who doesn't have a lot of cage time but has a lot of time in the gym, and it's hard to know what to expect out of them when they get cut, if they go back to the regionals and look dominant, or if things just never really quite pick up for them. So I hope to see Antonio dos Santos Jr. pick it up and turn right around and come back to the UFC. I think he's got the kind of talent to make that happen and be good there, if he can tighten up his striking so that he's not just charging in behind big shots. But if he doesn't, I wouldn't be totally shocked. Those are the only cuts. An interesting note to go along with that is the semi-retirement of Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. The UFC, Dana White particularly, has said that he's done and they're not giving him any more fights. But in true don't know when to hang him up fashion, Nogueira is talking about how he's not retired and he's going to have this job as a scout, and that's something he's been doing anyway, but he's still got fights that he wants in the UFC. And given enough time and pressure and willingness on his end, it'll be interesting to see if the UFC is serious about giving him, would actually consider giving him another fight. Until the fighter themselves say, I'm not fighting anymore, I'm done, it's really hard to know what to expect, whether or not they'll ever be back in the cage again. Certainly, I wouldn't be sad to see the UFC stick by their guns and keep Big Nog out of the game, but I don't know. It's a little early on to just say he's absolutely done permanently, unfortunately. Now, on the signing side of things, that's where things get a little more interesting. So, like I say, the UFC's actually picked up quite a few fighters over the last month, brought some people back, signed some people that didn't expect, and made some different, interesting moves out of it. Got a new light heavyweight in Leonardo Guimarães. He, Brazilian guy, long-time regional vet, been around for a while, not that young. I think, although I'm trying to remember if he's under 30 or not. I don't think he is. I think he's in his early 30s, but somebody who has been fighting since, his first fight was in 2005. He only started his career in earnest in 2010, so you could say, he's really only got the 5 or 6 years under his belt as a serious contestant in MMA. But I'm not sure how much to expect out of him. Kind of seems to have a regional, a game that does better than you'd expect regionally without being translating particularly well to the UFC. Really gets in a lot of competitive brawls on the regional Brazilian circuit and tends to win just by being able to throw more even when tired and having a pretty, tough chin. Gets cracked a lot. Not a great wrestler, not a great striker, but a very willing striker, kind of your classic Brazilian BJJ guy who wants to brawl a lot. I don't know how well he's going to do with that at light heavyweight. That seems like a division that's really hard on guys who do not have an ability to wrestle as well as strike. It seems like very much a wrestle boxer's division. But big prospect that flew way under the radar. The UFC picked up as well as a flyweight who's actually debuting tomorrow, Gene Herrera. Um, and he looks exceptional. He's coming out of a real small camp down in Florida. Um, has is basically an MMA native. It sounds like just kind of got into MMA as something to do, a way to challenge himself and channel his athletic ability, and it just looks like an elite athlete, like the kind of guy who excels no matter who's coaching him because he's got so many physical tools: fast, strong, hits with power, good aggressive grappler, good scrambler. He's fighting Ray Borg, which is a hell of a debut, but he's a guy that's really interesting to watch out for. Coast coming off tough, we got Kamaru Usman, Hader Hassan, and Michael Graves all came off that tough show. I don't know if other guys off the show. Well, we've already seen some other guys off the show. Steve Montgomery, among them, get shots, but um, Usman looks pretty exceptional in that group, and I have a lot of hope for him. We also saw Dominic Steele get brought in and already have his debut where he just got totally blasted by Zach Cummings. That's unfortunately a rough debut for Steele, who has kicked around. He's not a long time, it's not like he's done developing. He's not a long time fighter in the game, started in 2011, but has had a lot of experience since then. And I mean, Zach Cummings is a good fighter, but I don't know that he's necessarily way outside the margins of what Steele would expect to meet at welterweight. So that's kind of a tough wake up call for him. Timu Pakalan came in as well, fought Mikhail Labut. I'm really excited for what Pakalan can do in the future. Pakalan, Finnish prospect. There was a short notice fight for him. He looks like a really good physical athlete with a lot of parts of his game developing. I think he's pretty, still has some room to grow in the sport. Yeah, he's only been fighting since 2012, so he's got a lot of potential to develop a lot further than he has already. Just 7-1 now with that first loss of his career, but it was a close fight. No shame in that. Labut's a tough fighter, tough chin, tough grappler. Considering Paclin really wanted to try to out grapple Labut, that seemed like something that really actually lost him ground in that fight because he was kind of cracking Labut on the feet. But his willingness to take it to the ground and try and outwork him there gave Labut a chance to show his tough submission defense, reverse a lot of stuff, just kind of outwork Paclin. But Paclin's somebody I had a lot of interest in and a lot of hope for. What the UFC just picked up, so I'll be interested to see what he can do going forward. And otherwise, they picked up Courtney Casey Sanchez, who we saw debut already, I believe. Yeah, debut against Joanne Calderwood. There we go. Name just rolling off or staying on the tip of my tongue there. Saw her debut against Joanne Calderwood. She looked competitive and athletic. Definitely raw. Definitely needs a lot of time to come along in that division. I think strawweight does have a lot of talent like that, though, that could give Casey a lot of time to develop. There are fighters, or even fighters that she could beat who have a lot of experience. Fighters like Emily Kagan or Heather Clark or even Beck Rawlings, or fighters like that are competitive and tough, but not necessarily the same level of athlete. Or raw athletes that are developing. Tina Latamaki, Justine Kish potentially, Erica Almeida, fighters who are raw as well, just in the same ways that Casey is. Casey at least looked like she could crack and looked aggressive and like she was willing to put a lot of pressure on Calderwood. So it'll be interesting to see where she goes with that. And then last of all, over this month, they picked up Oluwale Bambozhe, I believe is how they are pronouncing that. I don't know. I've heard several things regionally, but I think John Anik, that was his, Oluwale Bambozhe. So Bambozhe looks like a fantastic athlete, really top flight, exciting, dynamic, throw anything at any time kind of fighter. Tends to charge in with a lot of straight punches and hooks mixed together. Finds his way around opponents' defenses. Willing to throw like jumping head kicks and spin kicks and all sorts of techniques. Does not have a lot of the basic fundamentals. Not the kind of guy who's going to work behind his jab and then throw a real tight cross hook, low or leg kick combination and stuff like that. He will tend to kind of hulk some takedowns in there and is kind of a top control, just lay and pray kind of guy on the ground. Doesn't have a really complicated top game, but does throw some nice knees. I'll say that from top control. When guys are trying to get up while he's laying on them, he will find some strikes, hit some hard strikes in transition, throws good knees in the clinch, things like that. He's fighting Uriah Hall for his debut, which, I mean, it's both a really tough task, but it's also the kind of fight that he could win. Hall's the kind of guy that's willing to give away stuff, but Bozhe seems like a long-term project for the UFC, somebody that's going to need a lot of time and a lot of development to become more than just an exciting athlete that can be scrappy. He needs to have some real technical and slow development over his game. And they signed Abdul. I guess I'll talk about it because I got so much time, and they signed him right at the end of the month. So I think it was technically in July. They signed light heavyweight Abdul Kareem Edelov. That was the last signing of the UFC for July. And I am really super excited about Edelov, despite the fact that he's Chechen president / controversial dictator, war criminal Kadyrov's nephew. That you can't choose your family. I don't know what to say. I don't know how much Edelov represents that same family line, but Edelov's been a guy who's been kicking around the Russian regional scene for a long time, which is kind of shocking considering he's still in his early 20s. I think he's just like 23. So he started really young. This is somebody who started his MMA career back in 2010, is just 23 now. So he's got 6 years, and he started fighting at 17. And over those first few years of his career, he was a really up and down fighter. I don't think, from all accounts I've heard, he didn't take training that seriously. But even if he did, he was fighting guys like Viktor Nemkov and Charles Andrade, and I believe even Abdulrahman Nurmagomedov, who just, they're really solid, tough guys on that circuit for a 17-year-old kid who's not taking the sport that seriously. It's not surprising he ended up with 4 losses early on. Since then, he's got wins over Yuri Prochazka, who's one of the top light heavyweight prospects out there, and has run off that's like the big win, but he's run off a bunch of wins over some other promising talent or decent fighters on the Russian circuit. Maybe even not some great guys, but a lot of first round finishes. He's looked like he's turned a corner in his training. He looks like he's a much more put together fighter than he was previously, and I'd consider him probably the most UFC ready regional light heavyweight in the world. Like the prospect who is most ready to jump straight into the UFC and compete with the top 10. He's a really good, strong wrestler, great top control, functional boxer, functional kickboxer, tough, big, like a good sized light heavyweight, UFC sized light heavyweight, which is one of the big problems a lot of guys have. He's 6'3" at 205 pounds. He's, a legit guy in the division, somebody who can really compete. I don't know that he's ever going to be a title contender, but I could see him being a really competitive, tough force in the division for another 5 years, or even like I've talked about this a lot recently, that I think guys who start really early like him do get more time. They're just also less consistent fighters. I could see Edelov being a top fringe top 5 guy at light heavyweight, somebody who never quite crosses the barrier but is around forever for like, you know, 7 or 8 more years right now, up until his early 30s. I could see him being a tough out at light heavyweight that people don't want to fight. So him getting to the UFC is a really big pickup for them. I think that's actually a big breath of fresh air for a division that does not get a lot of guys like him. So he's worth being excited about. Honestly, otherwise, that's all I got for you right now. This has been, usually when the UFC goes through their cuts lately, they've been cutting 10, 12 guys at a time, and it's been a lot to talk about. But this month, they just didn't. We got 2. There may be more that they didn't publish. Like I say, since you're going only by what they publish on the website, it could be that a lot of guys got released that just the UFC didn't disclose. I know personally for one guy that people were talking about, Eddie Gordon, I've heard is still in the UFC and will be apparently dropping to down to welterweight. So for people wondering about guys like him, it does sound like they might be getting another chance. So that's something to watch out for. And I'll be back next month to do another update on just what the hell's going on with the UFC roster. Thanks for tuning in.